In the humid twilight of St. Gabriel Parish, Louisiana, circa 1890, the air hung thick and heavy with the cloying scent of decaying magnolias and damp earth. This was a land of stark contrasts, where devout Catholicism was a thin veneer over a deep, ancient bedrock of folklore and superstition. The funeral of matriarch Genevieve Dubois was the epitome of Gilded Age opulence, a somber spectacle of wealth even in death. Amidst the veiled mourners and the hushed prayers, one figure moved with an unobtrusive, unpracticed solemnity: Elias, the parish sexton. To the grieving families, he was a pillar of quiet comfort, a man whose meticulous care for the final resting places of their loved ones was beyond reproach. His expression was a mask of pious duty, a facade so perfect that no one could perceive the cold, calculating avarice that corroded his soul from within. He was the silent guardian of the dead, and no one ever thought to question the guardian. The camera of our historical lens lingers on the deceased matriarch's hand, resting peacefully upon folded silk. Adorning her finger is a ring of exquisite craftsmanship, a large, deep blue sapphire flanked by diamonds, all set in heavy gold. It glints in the flickering candlelight of the chapel, a final, defiant symbol of the status and earthly power she once wielded. As Elias assists in sealing the casket, his gaze falls upon the jewel for a fraction of a second too long. It is not a look of admiration, but one of appraisal, a flicker of resentful hunger that is gone as quickly as it appears. He straightens up, his face once again a mask of solemn respect, but an unspoken transaction has just occurred in the privacy of his mind, a silent promise of a later visit, a profane appointment made with the dead. The weight of the earth would soon cover the coffin, but for Elias, it was not a final seal, but merely a temporary lock. That night, the St. Gabriel Cemetery transforms. Under the cold, impartial light of a slivered moon, the ornate wrought iron crosses and stone angels cast long, accusing shadows that writhe and stretch like skeletal fingers. The oppressive silence of the day gives way to a more profound, listening quiet, punctuated only by the chirping of cicadas and the distant rustle of unseen things in the cypress groves. It is in this profound stillness that a new, unnerving sound emerges, a rhythmic scraping, metal against stone and soil, a chilling, methodical sound that the few neighbors living on the cemetery's edge have learned to dismiss. They attribute it to the wind whistling through the ironwork, or perhaps to the restless spirits of local legend. They pull their covers tighter, say a quick prayer, and choose to believe the comforting lie over the terrifying truth of what that sound truly signifies. The source of the sound is a lone figure, silhouetted against a freshly turned mound of earth. It is Elias, his pious daytime demeanor shed like a snake's skin. Here, in the clandestine theater of the night, his movements are not those of a grieving servant, but of a skilled laborer with a nefarious purpose. He works with an unnerving efficiency, his shovel biting into the soft Louisiana soil with practiced ease. There is no frantic haste in his actions, only a cold, meticulous determination. This is not a desperate act of a common thief. It is a ritual, a calculated desecration performed with the precision of a surgeon. Each scoop of earth is a deliberate violation, a quiet rebellion against the wealthy families he serves by day and robs by night. The sacred ground, meant to be a place of eternal rest, has become his personal, illicit treasure vault. This singular act of sacrilege is but one chapter in a much older, darker story. Today, the legend of the old St. Gabriel Cemetery persists, a chilling piece of local folklore whispered from one generation to the next. It is known as a place of profound unease, a patch of land that holds its breath after the sun sets. Parents warn their children not to wander near its gates after dusk, not because of physical dangers, but because of a deeply ingrained cultural fear. They speak of a lingering sorrow that clings to the ancient oaks and the crumbling tombstones, a sense that the ground itself is a witness to some unforgivable sin. The story of that night, and many nights like it, has seeped into the very soil, poisoning the memory of the place and ensuring that the dead there never truly rest in peace. The whispers speak of more than just a general haunting. They tell a specific tale. They say that on the darkest nights, when the moon is new and the air is still, you can hear a woman weeping near the oldest section of the cemetery. the part built over what was once a sacred Choctaw burial mound. Some claim to have seen a shadowy figure, gaunt and stooped, wandering aimlessly among the graves, as if searching for something it can never recover. These stories are the legacy of Elias's greed, the supernatural fallout of his crimes. The question that hangs in the humid air, unanswered for over a century, is whether these are merely the ghost stories of a superstitious community, or if his profane acts truly awakened something ancient and vengeful, a guardian entity tied to the very land he so brazenly defiled. The legend is an echo that endures to this day, a testament to how a single man's darkness can cast a shadow that outlives him by a century. And since these stories travel through time and space, connecting the past with the present, tell us in the comments from which city you are joining us in this investigation and the exact time of your viewing. Your presence marks a new entry in this long, unsettling chronicle. With your own testimony recorded, let us return to that gilded age of secrets, back to 1890, and discover how the very first crack appeared in Elias's perfect, pious facade, setting in motion a chain of events that would doom him and haunt St. Gabriel Parish forever. The arrival of Father Matthew in St. Gabriel Parish was as quiet and unassuming as the man himself. Fresh from the seminary in New Orleans, his faith was a bright, unwavering flame, untested by the shadows that lingered in the rural corners of Louisiana. He was a man of books and prayer, his mind sharp and his gaze observant, accustomed to finding meaning in scripture and ritual. Unlike the older parishioners, whose beliefs were a tangled tapestry of Catholic doctrine and local folklore, Father Matthew saw the world in the clear, defined lines of dogma and sin. He carried with him an idealism that the humid, languid air of the parish had not yet managed to erode. He saw his new post not as an exile, but as a sacred duty, a chance to tend to a flock he believed was fundamentally good, if perhaps a little lost in its own traditions and superstitions. His presence was a new variable in an old, carefully balanced equation of secrets. During his initial weeks, Father Matthew made it a point to walk the grounds of the parish cemetery each morning. He found a solemn beauty in the way the early light filtered through the Spanish moss, casting ethereal patterns on the weathered stone of the angels and crosses. It was, by all accounts, a place of profound peace. Yet, the more he walked its paths, the more he felt a subtle, discordant note beneath the surface of its tranquility. It was a feeling he could not articulate, a spiritual dissonance that pricked at the edges of his consciousness. He would later describe it in a letter to his mentor as a silence that listens, a sense that the very ground beneath his feet was holding its breath, burdened by a weight that had nothing to do with the granite and marble that marked the dead. It was a sanctity that felt hollow, as if the prayers said over these graves were being swallowed by an ancient, indifferent earth before they could ever reach heaven. It was in this hallowed, yet unsettling space that he first made the proper acquaintance of Elias. He found the sexton tending to the Dubois family plot, his movements precise and respectful as he cleared away fallen leaves and weeds. Father Matthew observed a man wholly dedicated to his craft, his face a mask of solemn piety that seemed perfectly suited to his funereal profession. The priest offered a quiet word of praise for the immaculate condition of the grounds, and Elias responded with a humble, deferential nod, his voice a low murmur of gratitude. To the young priest, Elias was the embodiment of faithful service, a constant and reassuring presence in a place defined by loss. He was a fixture, as much a part of the cemetery's landscape as the ancient oaks that stood sentinel over the graves. At first glance, there was no reason to see him as anything other than what he appeared to be, a simple, devout servant of God and the dead. But Father Matthew's mind was trained to notice details, the small inconsistencies that betray a larger truth. A few weeks after their first meeting, he saw Elias leaving the town's general store. The priest noted, with a flicker of idle curiosity, the sexton's new boots. They were not the patched and worn-out footwear of a man on a meager parish salary, but sturdy, well-made leather that spoke of an unexpected prosperity. Later that same day, from the confessional screen he overheard Elias's voice at the mercantile next door, settling a long-standing credit account not with promises, but with the definitive, heavy clink of silver coins on the counter. These were minor observations, easily dismissed as good fortune or perhaps a small inheritance. Yet they lodged in the priest's mind, dissonant notes in the otherwise simple melody of the sexton's life. They were the first threads of a tapestry he had not yet begun to see, the first signs that the pious facade might conceal something far more complex. The first truly alarming sign, however, came not from his own observations, but from the tearful confession of a young woman named Adeline Boudreau. She had buried her father, a wealthy merchant, only a month prior. She came to Father Matthew not with a sin to confess, but with a terror to share. For 3 consecutive nights, she had been haunted by the same vivid, horrifying dream. In it, her father stood before her, not in peace, but in a state of profound anguish. His burial suit disheveled, he would hold up his hands and beg her, his voice a desperate, spectral whisper, to retrieve the gold pocket watch he had been buried with. He kept repeating the same phrase, a plea that chilled Adeline to her core. I cannot rest without it. They will not let me rest. She was convinced it was not a product of her grief, but a genuine message from a soul in torment, a desperate cry from beyond the grave. Father Matthew did his pastoral duty, offering words of comfort and reassurance. He explained that grief often manifests in unsettling ways, that the mind can play cruel tricks on a heart heavy with loss. He suggested prayers for the dead and for her own peace of mind. But as he spoke the familiar, soothing words, he found they offered little comfort even to himself. Adeline's terror was too palpable, too genuine to be dismissed as mere fantasy. The specificity of her father's plea, the focus on a single, valuable object, resonated with the priest's own unspoken disquiet. The story of the pocket watch clung to him long after Adeline had departed, a chilling addendum to his own growing list of inconsistencies. It was a story that felt less like a dream and more like a testimony, a piece of a puzzle whose terrible image was slowly, ominously coming into focus. The ground of St. Gabriel's cemetery, he was beginning to fear, was far from peaceful. It seemed Adeline's dream was not an isolated incident but the first stone in an avalanche of communal fear. Her story, shared in hushed tones with a trusted aunt, soon bled into the parish's bloodstream of gossip and rumor. Within a week, the whispers had taken root. People began to talk. Old fishermen, mending their nets by the bayou's edge, spoke of hearing things on their walks home past the cemetery late at night. Women gathered at the market, their voices low, sharing stories their children had told them about sounds drifting from beyond the iron gates after the sun had set. It was a slow-building dread, a collective anxiety that settled over the town like the oppressive humidity. The cemetery, once a place of somber respect, was rapidly becoming a subject of fear, a place to be avoided after dark. The unease was no longer confined to the sensitive soul of a young priest. It was now a palpable presence in the community. The rumors were disturbingly consistent. They did not speak of spectral apparitions or violent poltergeists, but of something far more intimate and sorrowful. The sounds were always described as laments, as expressions of a deep and inconsolable grief. Some claimed to hear the soft, muffled weeping of a woman near the newest graves, a sound that would cease the moment one drew too near. Others spoke of hushed, pleading whispers that seemed to emanate directly from the freshly turned earth, words just indistinct enough to be maddening. These were not the grand, terrifying hauntings of local legend, but small, personal expressions of misery. It was this quality that made them so profoundly unnerving. It was as if the dead themselves were stirring, not in anger, but in a state of profound and eternal distress, their final rest having been unforgivably and recently violated. When Father Matthew, hoping to gauge the man's reaction, casually mentioned the growing number of unsettling rumors to Elias, the sexton's response was both swift and sharp. He scoffed, his face tightening into a mask of scorn. He blamed the tales on the ignorant superstitions of the backwater folk and the hysterical grief of mourning families. He suggested that Father Matthew, being new to the area, was not yet accustomed to the local penchant for morbid fantasy. But beneath the derision, the priest detected something else. It was not the simple annoyance of a practical man dealing with foolishness. There was a coiled, defensive anger in Elias's eyes, a flash of resentful hostility that was entirely out of proportion to the priest's gentle inquiry. It was the reaction of a man not dismissing a rumor, but deflecting an accusation that had not yet been made, a reaction that only deepened the priest's burgeoning suspicion. That evening, as twilight bled across the sky and painted the stone angels in hues of orange and violet, Father Matthew stood at the cemetery gates, looking in. The place he had once seen as beautiful now appeared menacing, the shadows of the wrought iron crosses stretching towards him like accusing fingers. He was now armed with 3 distinct and troubling pieces of evidence: the inexplicable prosperity of the Sexton, the terrifyingly specific dream of a grieving daughter, and a growing chorus of whispers describing sounds of sorrow emanating from the newest graves. He could no longer attribute these things to coincidence or superstition. A pattern was emerging, one of profound sacrilege. The uneasy normal had finally fractured, revealing the festering wrongness beneath. He knew then that he had a sacred obligation to uncover the truth, no matter how monstrous it might be. The critical question was no longer if a sin was being committed here, but how deep its roots had grown. The heavens opened over St. Gabriel Parish in the 3rd week of September, 1890. It was not a gentle southern rain, but a deluge, a biblical torrent that turned the dusty roads into churning rivers of mud and beat against the stained glass windows of the old church with the fury of 1,000 tiny fists. For 2 days and 2 nights, the storm raged, its thunderous voice rattling the very foundations of the town, and its lightning illuminating the landscape in brief, ghastly flashes of white. The people of the parish huddled in their homes, praying for the tempest to pass, unaware that the relentless downpour was not an act of destruction, but of revelation. The water, in its indiscriminate fury, was a solvent, working to wash away not only the topsoil, but also the thin veneer of piety that concealed a deep and festering corruption within their most sacred ground. The storm was an unholy baptism, preparing to expose a sin that could no longer remain buried. When the sun finally broke through the bruised, retreating clouds on the 3rd morning, it revealed a world remade, glistening and raw. The air was thick with the scent of petrichor, wet pine, and the sweet, almost cloying perfume of battered magnolia blossoms littering the ground like fallen stars. The cemetery, in particular, was a scene of tranquil devastation. Marble angels wept trails of green algae. Iron crosses were festooned with Spanish moss heavy with rainwater, and the newer graves, those with their mounds of earth still soft and unsettled, had been transformed into sodden, misshapen lumps of clay. It was a landscape of profound stillness, the kind of quiet that follows a great and violent upheaval. An unsuspecting eye would have seen only the aftermath of a powerful storm, a natural disruption. But nature had merely set the stage for a far more unnatural and horrifying discovery, one that would irrevocably alter the community's perception of both the living and the dead. The catalyst for this discovery was not a man of the cloth or a grieving widow, but a 10-year-old boy named Jean-Paul Thibodeau and his scruffy terrier Ymoix Roux. Freed from the confines of his home after 2 days of storm-enforced imprisonment, Jean-Paul was chasing Roux through the tall, wet grass at the edge of the parish grounds. In a fit of joyous energy, the dog darted through the cemetery's wrought iron gates, which had been left slightly ajar. Jean-Paul, hesitant but unwilling to abandon his companion, followed him in. The dog, however, did not run aimlessly. It made a direct line for the far side of the cemetery, to a plot belonging to the recently deceased and widely respected Judge Alistair Beaumont. There, amidst the mud and debris, Roux began to bark with a frantic, insistent tone that was entirely different from his usual playful yaps. It was a sound of alarm, a primal warning that something was deeply, terribly wrong. Drawn by the dog's unnerving persistence, Jean-Paul cautiously approached the Beaumont plot. What he saw first was simply a mess. The torrential rain had carved a deep channel into the fresh grave, washing away a significant portion of the soil and creating a miniature ravine in the sacred earth. The carefully arranged wreaths and flowers had been swept aside, leaving a scene of muddy chaos. But as he drew closer, he realized the cavity was deeper than mere erosion could account for. It was a gaping wound in the ground, a sinkhole that plunged directly down toward the coffin. At the bottom of this muddy pit, a corner of the polished oak casket was visible, its lid splintered and pried askew. It was not the gentle work of shifting earth. The damage was jagged and violent, clear evidence of a forceful, human intervention that the storm had only served to unearth. From the dark, narrow gap between the coffin's body and its violated lid, something protruded. At first, Jean-Paul's mind struggled to process the image. It was pale, waxy, and starkly out of place against the dark wood and black mud. It was a human hand, the hand of Judge Beaumont, its skin already taking on the translucent quality of aged parchment. But the true horror was not the sight of the hand itself, but its condition. It was bare, stripped of the ornate gold signet ring the judge had famously worn for decades. More disturbing still were the fingers. They were not resting peacefully, but were bent back at sickening, impossible angles, twisted and broken. They formed a silent, gruesome testimony to the violence with which the ring had been ripped from them. A final, desperate struggle enacted upon a body that could no longer resist such a profane assault. For a long moment, the boy was paralyzed, his breath caught in his throat. The world seemed to shrink to that single, horrific image, the broken fingers, the pale flesh, the gaping, muddy maw of the desecrated grave. The sound of his dog barking faded into a dull ringing in his ears. This was a sight no child was ever meant to see, a brutal intrusion of the most abject human depravity into the innocent world of a summer morning. The shock then shattered, replaced by a wave of pure, unreasoning terror that sent an icy current through his veins. He turned and fled, a single, strangled cry escaping his lips, leaving his dog to continue its frantic barking over the open grave. His panicked flight was the sounding of an alarm, a signal that the uneasy whispers of the past few weeks were about to coalesce into a single, undeniable, and public horror. The news spread through St. Gabriel with the speed of a brush fire. Within the hour, a small, somber crowd had gathered at the cemetery gates, kept at a distance by the town's sole constable. Father Matthew was summoned from his morning prayers, his heart heavy with a grim sense of inevitability. As he pushed his way through the murmuring onlookers, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine dread, he felt none of their surprise. For him, this was not a new revelation, but a confirmation of a truth he had already begun to suspect. He saw the scene not as an isolated act of vandalism, but as the physical manifestation of the spiritual sickness he had sensed since his arrival. The rumors, the dream, the Sexton's prosperity, it all led to this moment, to this sacrilegious wound in the earth. The whispers had finally been given a gruesome, tangible form for all to see. Kneeling at the edge of the collapsed grave, Father Matthew looked past the obvious signs of robbery. He saw what the others did not, the profound act of desecration. The theft of a ring was a simple crime, but the breaking of the corpse's fingers was an act of intimate, contemptuous violence. It was a defilement that went beyond mere greed, suggesting a deep-seated rage against the deceased, a violation of the body's final sanctity. He recalled the tortured plea from Adeline Boudreau's dream, "I cannot rest without it," and understood it now not as a ghost's lament for a material object, but as a soul's cry against its own violent disturbance. This was not the work of common thieves. This was the work of someone intimately familiar with the dead, someone who moved among them without fear, and who harbored a hatred so profound it could not be contained even by the finality of the grave. The constable, a practical man named Thibodeau, Jean-Paul's father, quickly declared it the work of transient vagrants, a theory the townspeople readily accepted as it offered a simple, external source for the horror. But Father Matthew knew better. His gaze lifted from the violated coffin and drifted across the cemetery, past the weeping stone angels and the silent, watching oaks, until it settled on the small, unassuming shack that stood near the back gate. It was the home of Elias, the sexton. In that moment, the priest's suspicion hardened into a cold, terrifying certainty. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a picture of such monstrous piety and profanity that it made his soul ache. He knew, with the unshakable conviction of faith, that the evil responsible for this atrocity was not some faceless outsider, but a wolf who had been living amongst the flock all along. Standing up, his cassock stained with the mud of the desecrated grave, Father Matthew made a silent vow. He would not allow this sin to be dismissed as simple vandalism. He would not permit the community to soothe itself with convenient lies, while the sanctity of their dead was being systematically violated. The incident had shattered the uneasy normal. transforming his private disquiet into a public and undeniable crisis. The time for quiet observation and pastoral comfort was over. A profound evil had taken root in his parish, and he now understood that it was his sacred duty to expose it, to follow the trail of sacrilege back to its source, no matter how deeply it was buried or how piously it was disguised. The investigation had begun, not with a sheriff's decree, but with the quiet, resolute decision of a young priest standing over a desecrated grave, with the constable's facile explanation of transient vandals hanging in the air like a foul mist. Father Matthew found himself profoundly isolated in his conviction. He knew the truth was not to be found in the muddy, desecrated soil of the Beaumont plot, but in the brittle, forgotten pages of history. He turned away from the whispers of the crowd, his purpose now as cold and clear as a winter morning. His investigation would not begin with interrogations or accusations, but in the silent, dust-choked confines of the parish archives. This repository of souls, located in a damp, stone-walled room behind the main altar, held the records of every birth, every marriage, and every death in St. Gabriel for 2 centuries. It was a library of lives, and somewhere within its decaying bindings, he was certain he would find the genesis of the evil that now plagued his flock. The scent of aging paper and dried ink was thick, a funereal perfume of memory itself, and it was here that the priest would hunt for the ghost of a motive. The archives were a testament to entropy, a chaotic collection of leather-bound ledgers and loose sheaves of parchment stacked precariously on sagging wooden shelves. For days, Father Matthew immersed himself in this silent world, his cassock gathering a fine gray layer of dust as he painstakingly worked his way backward through time. He traced the parish's lineage, the land grants, the building of the church, and the consecration of the cemetery grounds. Most of it was mundane clerical work, records of tithes, expenses for altar wine, letters complaining of leaky roofs. Yet, the priest persevered, driven by an instinct that the defilement he had witnessed was not a new sin, but the echo of an old one. He felt like an archaeologist, carefully brushing away the accumulated sediment of years, searching for the single, fractured bone that would betray the nature of the beast buried beneath. His fingers, smudged with ink and grime, turned page after fragile page, each one a silent witness to a past that was not nearly as dead as it seemed. His search finally bore fruit in a small, unassuming journal bound in cracked, blackened leather, tucked away in a crate of miscellaneous 18th century documents. The spine was unmarked, its contents deemed irrelevant by generations of his predecessors. The script inside, a spidery, elegant French, belonged to a Father Jean-Luc Renaud, who had overseen the parish from 1785 to 1792. The initial entries were, like the others, a chronicle of daily life, baptisms of settlers' children, sermons on faith and fortitude in the New World, and detailed accounts of the construction of the original wooden chapel. Father Matthew felt a kinship with this long-dead priest, another man of God trying to plant the seeds of faith in this wild, humid landscape. He read of droughts and fevers, of small triumphs and profound sorrows. He was reading the biography of a church, but as he delved deeper into the year 1788, the tone of the entries began to shift from one of pastoral duty to one of grave, spiritual concern. The entry for October 12, 1788, was where the history of the parish took a dark and fateful turn. Father Renaud wrote of his decision to expand the small churchyard into a proper cemetery, choosing a gentle, oak-studded slope just north of the chapel. He described the land as beautiful and serene, perfect for a place of eternal rest. But his next lines were written with a different pressure, the ink darker, the words imbued with a sense of foreboding. He documented a visit from a local Choctaw elder, a man named Tuscaloosa, who came not with threats, but with a solemn warning. The elder explained that the chosen ground was sacred to his people. It was a burial mound, a place where generations of their honored dead had been interred with tokens and weapons for their journey into the next world. He spoke of guardian spirits, ancient entities bound to the soil and to the objects buried within it, whose duty it was to protect the sleep of their ancestors. Father Renaud, a man of his time, initially dismissed the warning as pagan superstition. He recorded his own arguments in the journal, his words full of the confident theology of his European education. He wrote of consecrating the ground in the name of the one true God, of the power of Christian burial rites to sanctify any piece of earth. But the elder's final words, which Renaud transcribed verbatim, seemed to have deeply unsettled him. Tuscaloosa had reportedly looked upon the priest not with anger, but with a profound pity, and said, "Your God may claim the soul, but the earth remembers what is given to it. To steal from the dead on this ground is to awaken what slumbers. The guardians do not distinguish between the graves of our people and the graves of yours. They only know theft, and they will reclaim not only the treasure but the thief himself, piece by piece." The entry ended with Renaud's own troubled admission, "His gravity has sown a seed of disquiet in my soul." Reading these words over a century later, a cold dread washed over Father Matthew. It was a perfect, chilling echo of the present horror. The broken fingers of Judge Beaumont, the desperate plea from Adeline Boudreau's dream, it all clicked into a terrifying new context. This was not merely about greed, it was about trespass. The desecrations were not just crimes against the Christian dead, but a violation of a far older, more primal pact. The journal transformed his investigation from a simple search for a common thief into a confrontation with a historical curse, a spiritual debt that had been accruing for 100 years and was now, finally, being called due. The whispers and laments heard in the night were no longer the product of local superstition. They were the first stirrings of the ancient guardians, roused from their slumber by a profane greed. He now understood that he was not just fighting a man, but the consequences of his church's own historical arrogance. While the priest was uncovering the supernatural roots of the sacrilege, Elias was becoming consumed by a more terrestrial, yet no less terrifying, form of torment. His carefully constructed world was beginning to fracture under the weight of his paranoia. The public discovery at the Beaumont grave had shattered his sense of untouchable security. He now felt the eyes of the townspeople on him, their hushed conversations seeming to fall silent whenever he approached. Every shadow in the cemetery seemed to lengthen and twist into an accusing shape. Every rustle of the wind through the Spanish moss sounded like a whispered accusation. He began to sleep in short, fitful bursts, tormented by nightmares in which the very corpses he had robbed sat up in their coffins, their empty eye sockets fixed upon him, their bony fingers pointing, their silent mouths forming his name. The illicit wealth he had accumulated brought him no comfort, only a gnawing, ever-present fear of discovery that was eroding his sanity. His escalating fear found its focus in Father Matthew. He saw the young priest not as a man of God, but as a relentless inquisitor, a direct threat to his freedom and his life. Elias began to watch him from a distance, his resentment curdling into a venomous hatred. He saw the priest walking the cemetery grounds, his head bowed in thought, and imagined him searching for clues. He saw him speaking with parishioners and was convinced the priest was poisoning their minds against him. This obsession manifested in increasingly aggressive behavior. One afternoon, as Father Matthew left the church, Elias confronted him directly, his voice a low, menacing growl. He accused the priest of being obsessed with pagan tales and morbid fantasies, and warned him to stop stirring up trouble among the good, simple folk of this parish. The piety was gone from his face, replaced by a raw, defensive fury that was far more revealing than any confession. Understanding that direct intimidation had failed, Elias shifted his tactics, launching a subtle but vicious campaign to discredit the priest within the community he was sworn to serve. He began to plant seeds of doubt among the more superstitious and less educated parishioners, the very people whose fears he had once scorned. He would speak to them in hushed, concerned tones after Sunday service, suggesting that the new priest's city education had filled his head with dangerous, ungodly ideas. He twisted Father Renaud's journal, which he had only heard about through gossip, into a sign of Matthew's unhealthy obsession with Native American folklore, implying it was a step away from heresy. He played on their deep-seated respect for tradition and their suspicion of outsiders, painting Father Matthew as a destabilizing force, a man who sought to replace their comfortable faith with dark, forgotten histories. His lies were a poison, slowly seeping into the heart of the parish. The strategy proved distressingly effective. A chill began to settle between Father Matthew and his flock, where once he was greeted with warmth, he now received hesitant nods and averted gazes. The confessional grew quieter. Parishioners who had previously shared their troubles with him now fell silent, their faces clouded with a suspicion they could not voice. He was becoming an outsider in his own church, isolated by the cunning manipulations of the very man he sought to expose. This social excommunication was a heavy burden, a test of his faith more profound than any theological debate he had encountered in the seminary. He was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the tangible evil of Elias's crimes, and another against the intangible, but no less potent, power of fear and misinformation that the Sexton wielded like a weapon. The path to the truth was becoming steeper and more treacherous with every passing day, but the isolation, rather than deterring him, only hardened his resolve. The words from Father Renaud's journal were a talisman against the doubt Elias was sowing. He reread the passage about the Choctaw curse until he had it memorized, its dire warning a constant reminder of the stakes. He understood that Elias's campaign of whispers was not merely the act of a guilty man trying to cover his tracks. It was a desperate attempt to silence a truth that was clawing its way into the light. The priest's burden was no longer just about exposing a thief. It was about saving his parish from a spiritual sickness that had been allowed to fester for far too long, a sickness that pitted neighbor against neighbor and twisted faith into a tool of deception. He knew that mere suspicion, even when backed by a century-old journal, was not enough to pierce the veil of lies Elias had woven. To defeat the Sexton, he needed more than a historical account of a curse. He needed irrefutable physical proof of a contemporary crime. The image of Judge Beaumont's broken fingers was seared into his memory, a gruesome but ultimately circumstantial piece of evidence. The constable was satisfied, the town was moving on, and Elias was hiding in plain sight, protected by his own carefully crafted rumors. Father Matthew realized that to force the hand of secular justice and expose the full, monstrous scope of the Sexton's depravity, he would have to petition for an act that was, in its own way, a form of sacrilege. He would have to convince Constable Thibodeau to do the unthinkable, to disturb the dead once more, to open another grave, and to pray that the horror within would be enough to finally bring the truth to light. The thought was abhorrent to him, a violation of the very sanctity he was trying to protect. His mind turned to the Boudreau family plot. He remembered the chilling, specific detail of Adeline's dream, her father's plea for his gold pocket watch. It was a story the constable had dismissed as grief-induced hysteria, but which the priest now saw as a potential key. If Adeline's father had been buried with other valuables, as was the custom for a wealthy merchant, then his grave might hold the proof he so desperately needed. The thought of proposing such an action filled him with a deep sense of pastoral failure. He was supposed to be the guardian of these souls, eternal rest, not the agent of its disturbance. Yet the alternative, allowing Elias to continue his profane work, allowing the ancient curse to deepen its hold on his parish, was infinitely worse. He was caught in an impossible theological and ethical bind, a crucible that would test the very limits of his faith and his duty. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight set the stained glass windows of his church ablaze, Father Matthew made his decision. He would approach Constable Thibodeau with his theory, armed with the historical context of the journal and the chilling testimony of Adeline's dream. He would argue that the desecration of Judge Beaumont's grave was not an isolated incident but part of a systematic campaign of plunder. He knew the constable, a man of simple facts and tangible evidence, would be deeply skeptical. The idea of exhuming a body based on a century-old legend and a young woman's nightmare would seem like madness. The priest would have to use all his powers of persuasion, all the authority of his office, to convince him that a lesser sacrilege was necessary to prevent a greater one from continuing unabated. The weight of this decision settled upon him like a shroud. He knelt before the altar, the familiar scent of old wood and beeswax a small comfort in his turmoil. He was about to cross a line, to advocate for an act that ran contrary to his every instinct as a priest. He prayed for guidance, for the strength to see this through, and for forgiveness for the disturbance he was about to cause. He was no longer just a shepherd to his flock. He was now a reluctant detective, a historian of the macabre, forced to dig into the past to save the present. The investigation had reached its critical juncture. The archives had given him the motive and the method. Now he needed a body, a second, silent witness whose desecrated form would speak the truth that the living were too frightened or too deceived to hear. He found the constable at his small desk in the town's modest jailhouse. poring over paperwork by the light of a kerosene lamp. Thibodeau was a large, weary man, his face etched with the lines of someone who had seen too much of the petty cruelties of the world and had little patience for its mysteries. He listened to the priest's story with a stony expression, his fingers drumming a slow, skeptical rhythm on the wooden desktop. Father Matthew laid it all out: the sexton's sudden wealth, the consistent rumors of weeping from the graves, the chillingly specific details of Adeline's dream, and finally, the damning historical context provided by Father Renaud's journal. He presented it not as a ghost story, but as a criminal profile, a pattern of escalating behavior that pointed to a single, unthinkable conclusion. The pious guardian of their cemetery was, in fact, its most prolific predator. The constable sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of pure exhaustion. He rubbed his eyes and looked at the young priest as if he were a particularly difficult puzzle. He dismissed the journal as old stories and the dream as female hysterics. In his world, crimes were committed by hungry vagrants, not by God-fearing church sextons who had served the community for 20 years. To him, exhuming the body of a respected merchant like Adeline's father was not just unorthodox, it was political suicide. The Boudreau family was influential, and such an act, if it yielded nothing, would bring ruin upon them both. He was about to dismiss the priest outright, to tell him to stick to prayers and leave police work to the police. The risk was too great, the evidence too ethereal, the entire proposition too steeped in the very superstition he disdained. But then Father Matthew leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. He did not speak of curses or spirits. He spoke of evidence. "Constable," he said, "I saw the man's hands. Judge Beaumont's fingers were not bent. They were broken, snapped backward. That is not the work of a common thief in a hurry. That is an act of rage, of hatred. It is personal, and if Elias has done it once, he has done it before. Adeline's father was buried 2 weeks before the judge. If I am wrong, then I will take full responsibility. I will leave this parish in disgrace. But if I am right, we will stop a monster who is hiding in the shadow of the cross." It was this final visceral detail, the image of the broken fingers, that finally broke through the constable's wall of skepticism. It was a piece of the puzzle that did not fit his simple theory. A long, heavy silence filled the small office, punctuated only by the hiss of the lamp and the distant chirping of crickets. Constable Thibodeau stared at the priest, then at the darkened window, and then back at his own calloused hands. He was a man who trusted what he could see and touch, and the priest had given him a tangible, gruesome image that he could not easily dismiss. The risk was still enormous, the potential for public outcry immense, but the alternative, the possibility that the priest was right and that a ghoul was walking among them, preying on their dead under the cover of piety, was a thought that chilled him to the bone. With a final, reluctant sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire town's dead, he gave a single, sharp nod. The exhumation would proceed. It would be done in secret, under the cover of the coming night, a clandestine operation to uncover a clandestine evil. The moon was a sliver of bone in the ink-black sky, offering little light and no comfort as 4 figures entered the St. Gabriel cemetery. The air was unnaturally still, thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the damp, metallic smell of the freshly soaked earth. Constable Thibodeau, his face a grim mask of resolve, was accompanied by 2 trusted deputies, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows that made the stone angels seem to weep. Father Matthew walked beside them, his rosary clutched in one hand, his heart a heavy, leaden weight in his chest. There was no sound but the soft squelch of their boots in the mud and the rhythmic, ominous creak of the cemetery's iron gate swinging shut behind them, sealing them inside with the silent, waiting dead. Their destination was the Boudreau family plot, a place of supposed peace they were about to violate in the name of a terrible, necessary truth. The work began in a hushed, almost reverent silence. The deputies' shovels bit into the soft, rain-loosened soil with a sound like a mournful sigh, a stark contrast to the sharp, frantic scraping of a thief's tool. Father Matthew stood by, holding a lantern aloft, its golden light illuminating the grim, methodical process. Each shovelful of earth felt like a peeled-back layer of a festering secret, a slow and deliberate exhumation of not just a body, but of the parish's buried sins. Constable Thibodeau watched, his arms crossed, his initial skepticism having curdled into a cold, palpable dread. The deeper the men dug, the heavier the silence became, a profound, listening quiet that seemed to emanate from the surrounding graves. They were intruders here, disturbing a slumber that was meant to be eternal, and the very ground seemed to be holding its breath in anticipation of what they would find in its violated depths. After what felt like an eternity, a shovel struck wood with a dull, hollow thud that echoed in the oppressive stillness. The sound, so final and definitive, sent a shudder through the small group. The deputies worked with their hands now, clearing the last layers of soil with a care that bordered on tenderness, exposing the dark, polished mahogany of the casket lid. It was intact, showing no outward signs of the violent tampering they had found at Judge Beaumont's grave. For a fleeting moment, a sliver of hope or perhaps fear flickered in the constable's eyes. Perhaps the priest was wrong. Perhaps this was all a terrible, grief-fueled mistake. But Father Matthew's expression remained unchanged, his gaze fixed upon the coffin with a look of grim certainty. He knew the true horror was not in the disturbance of the grave, but in the defilement that lay concealed within its sealed and silent interior. With a shared, reluctant glance, the deputies inserted their crowbars into the seam of the lid. The screech of protesting nails was a piercing, profane sound in the sacred quiet, a final cry of resistance from the disturbed tomb. As the heavy lid was pried open, a faint, sweetish odor of decay and embalming fluid, mingled with the scent of rotting silk, wafted into the night air. The lantern light fell upon the face of Adeline's father. He appeared peaceful, his features composed in a waxy, serene repose. But Father Matthew did not look at his face. He directed the constable to lower the lantern, to illuminate the man's chest, where his hands were crossed over a prayer book. The gold pocket watch, the object of Adeline's tortured dream, was gone. But that was not the discovery that made the constable recoil with a choked gasp. It was the man's mouth, which was unnaturally agape, his lips pulled back in a silent, gruesome snarl. The source of the horror was immediately, sickeningly apparent. The merchant had been known for the 2 gold crowns that adorned his front teeth, a mark of his considerable wealth. They were missing, but they had not been delicately removed. The man's gums were a shredded, blackened ruin, the surrounding teeth chipped and broken from the brutal force of the extraction. It was the work of pliers, a crude and violent act of butchery performed upon a corpse. The image was one of such profound and intimate desecration that it transcended mere robbery, revealing a depravity that was almost beyond comprehension. This was the irrefutable proof Father Matthew had sought, a silent, gruesome testimony that was more powerful than any dream or rumor. The constable, his face pale and beaded with sweat in the lantern light, slowly turned to the priest. All doubt had been extinguished, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. The hunt was no longer for a thief, it was for a monster. Leaving the deputies to the grim task of respectfully reinterring the violated body, Father Matthew and the constable made their way directly to the sexton's shack at the far edge of the cemetery grounds. The small, clapboard structure stood dark and silent, a humble dwelling that projected an image of simple poverty. It was the perfect camouflage, a facade of pious modesty that had hidden a ravenous greed for years. There was no light within, no sign of its occupant. The constable did not bother to knock. He put his shoulder to the flimsy door, and it splintered open with a sharp crack, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn stillness. They stepped inside, their lanterns cutting through the darkness, revealing a space that was as deceptive as the man who lived in it. The single room was sparse, almost monastic in its simplicity, with a narrow cot, a small table, and a single wooden chair, all kept in a state of meticulous, unnerving cleanliness. A faint, cloying odor hung in the air, a scent that Father Matthew recognized with a sickening lurch in his stomach. It was the smell of death, thinly veiled by the sharp, chemical scent of lye soap. While the constable began a methodical search of the room's few meager contents, the priest stood in the center, his senses attuned to the profound wrongness of the place. His gaze fell upon the floorboards. They were old, worn smooth by years of use, but one board, directly beneath the cot, seemed different. It was cleaner than the others, its edges sharper, as if it had been disturbed recently and often. He pointed, and the constable, understanding immediately, brought over a crowbar from his satchel. He wedged the tip into the seam and pried. The board came up with a soft groan of protesting wood, revealing a dark, square cavity in the packed earth foundation beneath. The secret heart of Elias's profane enterprise had been exposed. From the dark recess, the constable lifted a heavy, ornately carved wooden box, its surface polished to a high sheen. It was far too fine a piece for a poor sexton's shack, likely the first item Elias had ever stolen. He placed it on the small table and, with a sense of profound finality, lifted the lid. The lantern light caught the hoard within, and for a moment, both men were silent, stunned by the sheer volume of the illicit treasure. Gold rings set with precious stones, diamond brooches, silver lockets, and elegant pearl necklaces lay tangled together. A pirate's bounty stolen not from ships, but from the sanctified earth. There, resting atop a pile of glittering jewels, was the Boudreaux family's gold pocket watch, its chain coiled around it like a sleeping serpent. The sight was a confirmation of Elias's guilt, a dazzling and damning testament to years of systematic, sacrilegious plunder that had gone entirely unnoticed. But as the constable sifted through the jewelry, he uncovered a second, smaller compartment within the box, lined with faded red velvet. What lay inside was the true apotheosis of the sexton's horror. It was not jewelry, but a small, gruesome collection of human trophies. A dozen gold teeth, some still bearing tiny, clinging fragments of jawbone were arranged in a neat, orderly row. They glinted dully in the light, a macabre and irrefutable catalogue of his most brutal desecrations. The sight was so profoundly vile, so far beyond the pale of normal human greed, that the constable had to turn away, his face ashen. It was one thing to steal from the dead, but it was another entirely to mutilate them, to pry the very gold from their bones with such savage, intimate violence. This was not the work of a simple thief. This was the meticulous, obsessive collection of a predator who saw the dead not as souls to be respected, but as raw materials to be harvested. Beneath this gruesome collection, tucked into the very bottom of the box, was a small, leather-bound ledger. Father Matthew picked it up, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. The first few pages were a chillingly precise record of Elias's crimes, written in a neat, controlled script. Each entry listed a name, a date of burial, and a detailed inventory of the items stolen, along with their estimated monetary value. It was the cold, dispassionate accounting of a businessman liquidating his assets. But as the priest turned the pages, the nature of the entries began to change. The neat script grew frantic and disjointed, the financial records giving way to a diary of a mind in the process of complete disintegration. The margins were filled with wild, spidery sketches of skeletal faces with gaping, accusatory mouths, their empty eye sockets seeming to stare out from the page with a silent, burning hatred. The final pages were barely legible, a chaotic scrawl of repeated, desperate phrases that spiraled across the paper. "Give it back," he had written, over and over again. "It is not mine. It belongs to them." Interspersed with these pleas were terrified descriptions of sounds only he could hear. A woman's soft weeping that came from beneath his floorboards, a man's angry whisper that rode on the night wind, and most persistently, the dry, metallic crunch of pliers on bone and the rhythmic scrape of a shovel on stone. It was a perfect, horrifying chronicle of his descent into madness, a testament to a guilt so profound it had fractured his sanity. The Choctaw elder's prophecy, recorded a century earlier by Father Renaud, had come true. The guardians of the ground had begun to reclaim their treasure, not by force, but by systematically dismantling the thief's mind, piece by agonizing piece. They found Elias not in his shack, but in the main chapel of the church, kneeling before the high altar, as if in deep, pious prayer. The first light of dawn was filtering through the stained glass windows, bathing him in the ethereal, colored light of saints and martyrs. The juxtaposition was grotesque. A ghoul seeking sanctuary in the very house of the God whose laws he had so profoundly violated. When he saw the priest and the constable approach, he did not seem surprised. The mask of piety he had worn for so long was gone, his face a hollowed-out landscape of terror and exhaustion. The constable placed the open box of treasures on the polished wood of the communion rail, the jewels and gold teeth a profane offering in the sacred space. Elias stared at it, not with the pride of a collector, but with the abject horror of a man confronting the physical manifestation of his own damnation. His confession was not a confession at all, but a delirious, broken torrent of words that poured from him like poison from a wound. He admitted to everything, his voice a hoarse, rattling whisper that echoed in the vast empty church. He spoke of a lifetime of resentment, of watching the town's wealthy families bury their dead with treasures he could never hope to earn in 100 lifetimes of honest work. He described how this slow-burning hatred had curdled into a cold, pragmatic greed, how he had come to see the cemetery not as a holy ground, but as his own private, inexhaustible mine. He detailed his methods with a chilling, practiced lucidity, explaining how he would wait for the ground to settle, how he learned to pry open a casket with minimal noise, and how he perfected the art of appearing the perfect grieving servant by day while becoming a butcher of the dead by night. But then his tone shifted, the rational narrative of his crimes dissolving into the frantic babble of a man tormented by forces he could not comprehend. He swore that the money was a curse, that every stolen ring felt like a manacle on his soul. He began to talk about the voices. He claimed it started as a faint whisper, a sound he could dismiss as the wind, but soon, the whispers became words, and the words became a chorus of demands that followed him everywhere. He described how the dead would speak to him in his dreams, not with threats of hellfire, but with simple, relentless pleas for the return of their property. "The watch does not keep time for you," one would say. "My wife's hands are cold without her ring," another would lament. They were not vengeful spirits, he sobbed, but tormented souls unable to rest, their eternal peace contingent on the return of these meaningless earthly trinkets. Elias clutched his head, his body rocking back and forth on the cold stone floor, a man utterly broken by his own sacrilege. "They won't let me sleep," he cried, his voice cracking with despair. "They don't want my soul. They just want what is theirs. They told me they would take it back piece by piece." He looked up at Father Matthew, his eyes wide with a madness that was both terrifying and pitiable. In that moment, he was no longer a calculating monster, but a vessel for a century-old curse, the living embodiment of a warning that had been ignored. The mystery of the St. Gabriel Cemetery was solved, but the resolution brought no peace. Only the horrifying confirmation that some sins are so profound, they awaken an older, more patient form of justice, the kind of justice that does not claim a man's life, but instead, meticulously and eternally, reclaims his sanity. The fate of Elias was not a swift, clean punishment delivered by the hangman's noose, but a slow, meticulous unraveling orchestrated by forces far older than Louisiana's state laws. He was committed to the Jackson Asylum, his official diagnosis recorded in the Coldron clinical script of a Dr. Antoine Lefebvre as acute religious paranoia with auditory hallucinations. But the asylum's records fail to capture the true nature of his torment. He spent his remaining 27 years in a small, whitewashed room, a cell that became his final tomb. He spoke to no one, save for the shadows that danced in the corners, to whom he would whisper frantic apologies and promises of restitution. Nurses reported that he slept only in brief, terrified snatches, often waking with a strangled cry, his hands clawed as if trying to return something to an unseen accuser. He died in 1917, his body emaciated, his fingernails worn down to the quick from decades of clawing at the unyielding plaster walls, forever trying to dig his way out of a prison of his own making. The discovery of Elias's crimes sent a tremor of profound horror and shame through the heart of St. Gabriel Parish. It was a dual violation. Not only had their sacred dead been systematically desecrated, but the perpetrator was a man they had trusted, a man who had offered them comfort in their moments of deepest grief. In the weeks that followed, Father Matthew led a solemn public ceremony to reconsecrate the entire cemetery, a desperate attempt to wash away the spiritual stain left by the Sexton's sacrilege. But the ritual offered little comfort. A deep-seated distrust of the ground itself had taken root. Quietly, without public discussion, the wealthier families began the grim process of exhuming their loved ones and moving them to newer, untainted cemeteries in Baton Rouge and New Orleans. The old parish ground, once a symbol of community and eternal rest, was now irrevocably marked by a sin that no amount of holy water could ever truly cleanse. Father Matthew, burdened by a sense of pastoral duty, took it upon himself to return the stolen treasures. This was not a triumphant restoration of justice, but a series of quiet, painful encounters, each one reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. He met with the families one by one, presenting them with the recovered lockets, rings, and brooches from Elias's macabre hoard. The Boudreau family received their father's gold watch, but the object, once a symbol of paternal pride, was now a cursed artifact, a tangible reminder of the butchery performed upon his corpse. Many families refused to accept the items, seeing them as irrevocably tainted. Some had the jewelry melted down, while others, in a final act of superstitious dread, cast the defiled heirlooms into the deep, murky waters of the Mississippi River, hoping the current would carry the curse far away from their homes and their memories. For Father Matthew, the ordeal became the defining crucible of his life and his faith. He was not celebrated as a hero who had exposed a monster. Instead, he became inextricably linked to the darkness he had uncovered. To many of the older, more superstitious parishioners, he was the man who had disturbed the dead, the one who had given voice to a century-old curse. The warmth and trust he had initially been shown was replaced by a wary, fearful respect. He remained the priest of St. Gabriel for another 40 years, a solitary, somber figure who was often seen walking the lonely paths of the increasingly neglected cemetery. He became its reluctant guardian, his life a long penance for a sin that was not his own, his story forever intertwined with that of the grave-robbing Sexton he had brought to justice, a silent testament to the terrible cost of unearthing a buried truth. The cemetery itself fell into a long, slow decay. As families moved their dead and the parish's focus shifted to a new burial ground on the other side of town, the old site was gradually abandoned. Nature began its patient work of reclamation. The ornate iron fences rusted and sagged, their gates hanging permanently askew. Spanish moss, like gray skeletal fingers, and grew thick and heavy on the ancient oaks, obscuring the names carved into the tilting, weather-stained tombstones. The once manicured paths became overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, the ordered rows of graves dissolving into a chaotic landscape of crumbling stone and encroaching wilderness. The physical decline of the cemetery was a perfect mirror of its spiritual fall from grace. It was no longer a place of quiet remembrance, but a shunned, foreboding landscape, a physical scar on the edge of the community that served as a constant, silent reminder of the profound violation that had occurred within its consecrated soil. Over the decades, the documented history of Elias the Sexton slowly dissolved, its sharp, factual edges worn smooth by time and retelling until it recrystallized into the durable, sorrow-haunting form of local legend. The complex story of a man's resentment, greed, and subsequent madness was simplified into a chilling morality tale. He became the Sexton of St. Gabriel, a supernatural bogeyman, his story told in hushed tones to misbehaving children as a warning against disrespect for the dead. The intricate details of Father Renault's journal and the Choctaw curse were absorbed into the narrative, not as historical context but as proof of the cemetery's inherent evil. The crime was no longer a specific event that occurred in 1890. It had become a timeless myth, a permanent part of the parish's cultural DNA, a story that explained why the very ground in that place felt wrong, as if it were forever holding its breath. The legend, like all enduring folklore, attached specific, recurring supernatural phenomena to the blighted location, giving the general sense of dread a tangible form. The communal whispers of sorrow that had first alerted Father Matthew to the sacrilege became a permanent and sorrowful fixture of the cemetery's lore. Locals, particularly those living on the old road that borders the grounds, claimed that on nights when the air is still and heavy, one can still hear the distinct, heartbreaking sound of a woman weeping. The sound is said to emanate from the oldest section of the cemetery, near the grand étage, now crumbling mausoleum of the Dubois family. It is believed to be the spirit of the matriarch, the first victim of Elias's greed, her soul unable to find peace, her eternal rest forever disturbed by the memory of the violation. A single, sorrowful voice that serves as a perpetual echo of the first sin. Yet, the most persistent and unnerving element of the haunting is not the sound of grief, but the sound of work. It is the spectral echo of Elias's profane labor, a sound that has chilled generations of thrill-seekers and accidental trespassers. They speak of a rhythmic, metallic scraping noise that cuts through the silence of the night, often accompanied by the dull thud of earth being tossed aside. It is never a frantic or hurried sound. It is described as slow, methodical, and tireless, the work of a man condemned to repeat his crime for all eternity. It is the sound of Elias, or the memory of him, forever bound to the soil he defiled. He is the restless spirit of the place, not a vengeful ghost, but a tormented one, eternally digging, eternally searching for the treasures he was forced to relinquish, forever trapped in the opening act of his own damnation. Today, the old St. Gabriel Cemetery exists in a state of arrested decay. It is no longer a place of active mourning, but has become a destination for historians, photographers, and paranormal investigators, drawn by its Gothic beauty and its dark, compelling story. Local tour guides now walk its overgrown paths, their voices hushed as they point out the final resting places of Judge Beaumont and the Boudreaux family. They tell a simplified, dramatic version of the Sexton's tale, often ending near the rusted gates as twilight falls. They speak of the weeping woman and the phantom sounds of the shovel, concluding with the well-worn warning that on the darkest nights, when the moon is new and the air is still, the work of the grave-robbing Sexton continues. The horrific, documented crimes of a desperate man have been fully transformed into a piece of cultural heritage, a dark commodity that ensures the story, and the unease will never truly be buried. This leaves us with the final, unsettling question that hangs over the crumbling tombstones of St. Gabriel to this day. Was the madness that consumed Elias simply the predictable result of a mind collapsing under the weight of its own profound guilt? A psychological haunting born of sacrilege and fear? Or was it the literal, methodical fulfillment of a century-old prophecy? Was he tormented by his own conscience? Or was he truly being reclaimed, piece by agonizing piece, by the ancient, patient guardians of a land that never forgets a debt? The answer lies buried with him, in the haunted soil of Louisiana. To ensure that the chapters of our history that lie in shadow are never truly forgotten, subscribe and help us preserve the archives of the macabre.